He had the money. He had the power. But when his million-dollar deal was about to crash and burn, nobody expected the quiet maid in the corner to stand up, open her mouth, and save everything with a hidden talent that left the entire room speechless. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Ethan Cross was a man used to winning. By 35, he owned 3 thriving companies, a sleek black penthouse that pierced the Manhattan skyline, and enough arrogance to fill every glass-walled office he stepped into. Every meeting, every handshake, every deal, he believed. They were all just waiting for his signature to make them real. He called it vision. Others called it ego. Either way, it always worked in his favor. When Ethan strutted into the crystal-lit conference room that Thursday morning, he was already picturing the champagne toast that would follow. The room itself seemed to applaud him, floor to ceiling. Windows showered the mahogany table in golden sunlight, while a panoramic view of the city glittered behind him like a crown. 12 high-profile investors sat waiting, their suits crisp, their watches more expensive than most people's cars. Ethan flashed them a practiced smile, the one that hinted he knew more than he was saying, and that he would make everyone in the room richer than they'd dreamed. He adjusted his cufflinks, cleared his throat, and launched into his pitch. The slides flickered across the massive screen. 3D renderings of an exclusive oceanfront resort, private villas carved into white cliffs, infinity pools spilling into the turquoise sea. He spoke of profits, celebrity guests, tax breaks, all tied together by the promise of prestige. His voice dripped confidence. Every word was a hook meant to reel them in. He didn't notice the small figure moving quietly along the edge of the room. Rosa, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun, her plain uniform crisp and spotless, was polishing the windowsills behind the giant conference table. The brass name tag on her chest read Rosa Alvarez. Not that anyone ever bothered to read it. She was invisible in these halls of power, her presence folding into the marble floors and gleaming fixtures she scrubbed clean each dawn. But today, Rosa listened. She always listened. It made the hours pass faster. English wasn't her first language, but she'd picked up more than most people assumed. She knew the big man was called Mr. Cross. She knew the men and women in suits clung to his every word like children chasing a balloon. She also knew he was missing something. Ethan concluded with a flourish, a dramatic pause, a knowing smile. Then the final slide. Projected profit margins with more zeros than Rosa could count. He waited for the room to erupt in approval. But the silence stretched. One investor leaned forward, brow furrowed. "Ethan," he said slowly, "these numbers are impressive, but the Coastal Regulation Board's requirements have changed. There's no mention of the new environmental impact measures. How do you plan to address that?" Ethan's smile flickered for a heartbeat. He launched into a confident deflection, promising an expedited approval, special consultants, all buzzwords that once worked like magic. But the investors exchanged glances. Rosa, dusting behind the heavy velvet drapes, now paused. She knew exactly what they were talking about. She'd overheard the security guards gossiping about the new coastal law last week, how it would block big resorts unless they presented a sustainable plan. Another investor cleared her throat. "If the local board rejects your plan, the whole deal stalls. Ethan, you have a workaround." Ethan's charm strained at the edges. He paced to the head of the table, spread his hands, and gave them his trademark grin. "Gentlemen, ladies, let me worry about that. I have people who handle these small details." But the room didn't laugh. Small details, they all knew, were where multi-million-dollar dreams died. Rosa's fingers itched. She wasn't supposed to speak. She never spoke, but the words pushed at her ribs. She knew something they didn't, a loophole, a new provision buried in the county's public notice. If only someone would listen. She turned, clutching her rag in one hand. For a moment, she imagined stepping forward, clearing her throat, and telling them, "Excuse me, sir. If you build solar terraces, if you partner with local fishery cooperatives, the board can grant an exemption." She could see it so clearly. She'd read the flyer when she waited at the bus stop at dawn. She still had it, folded carefully in her pocket, but no one looked at her. Ethan didn't see her. Not yet. If he kept talking, his voice louder now, a slight edge creeping in. He knew he was losing them. The eyes around the table grew colder, skeptical. Pins tapped. Throats cleared. He was a man used to winning. But this time, he was blind to the one thing that could save him. Behind him, Rosa pressed her hand to the paper in her pocket. She took a breath. Maybe today, for once, someone would notice the maid. And maybe, just maybe, the maid would speak. The meeting started strong. Ethan spoke with the kind of charm that had closed dozens of so-called impossible deals. Before breakfast, he stood at the head of the conference table like a conductor before an orchestra, hands moving gracefully as he painted his vision. A private resort on one of the last untouched stretches of the eastern coastline. Luxury villas perched on cliffs, infinity pools that seemed to spill into the ocean, world-class restaurants designed to lure celebrities and billionaires alike. The suits across from him, seasoned real estate moguls and cold-eyed venture capitalists, leaned forward, nodding at his slides, jotting notes in leather-bound portfolios. To Ethan, this was as good as signed. He felt the familiar rush in his veins, that hit of power that came when people bent toward his will. He clicked through renderings and bullet points, his voice smooth as glass. We're looking at a 30% return in the first 18 months. Exclusive access means premium rates. We're not just building a resort, we're creating an icon. The Hamptons meets Monaco, but better. A polite chuckle rolled down the table. Ethan soaked it in, feeding off the gleam of interest in their eyes. He could almost hear the celebratory corks popping in his penthouse later tonight. But then, from the far end of the table, came the clearing of a throat. A small, sharp sound that cut through his daydream like a needle through silk. Your numbers look good, Ethan. The voice belonged to Mr. Davenport, a gray-haired titan of old New York real estate, rumored to own half of Fifth Avenue's historic blocks. He didn't bother looking at the glossy brochure Ethan's assistant had laid out for him. He was looking at Ethan. Only Ethan. But your plans for local permits? Davenport lifted a single eyebrow. There's no way the city council signs off on this beachfront construction. The zoning is tight. And the new environmental board, they'll shut you down before you break ground. Environmental groups will bury you in lawsuits. We can't risk it. A flicker of something passed through Ethan's perfect smile. A tiny fracture that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't watched 100 young sharks crash into the real world and drown. He forced a laugh, a little too bright, a little too quick. Davenport, with respect, my legal team specializes in this. We've handled trickier councils than Easton Beach. A couple of donations in the right places, some partnerships with local initiatives. It's a formality. A low murmur passed down the table, the kind that didn't sound like agreement. A younger investor leaned back in his chair, arms folded, mouth tight. Another snapped his briefcase shut. The soft chorus of retreat. Ethan hated that sound. He pressed forward, ramping up the charm, tossing out big words and bigger promises. He spun stories about beachfront cleanups, local jobs, tax revenue. But every word seemed to land a little flatter than the one before. The big screen behind him, once so dazzling with glittering renderings, now just flickered with static numbers and impossible dreams. Davenport pushed his chair back with a scrape that echoed too loud in the high-ceilinged room. I like ambition, Ethan. Always have. But this. He gestured at the pristine white beaches on the final slide. You're building a castle on sand. I can't sink capital into a PR nightmare. One by one, the others began to move. Papers shuffled. Portfolios closed with quiet snaps. The rustle of tailored suits brushing against polished chairs felt deafening to Ethan's ears. Gentlemen, ladies, he started, but his voice betrayed him. The pitch that usually carried an entire boardroom felt suddenly too thin, like a thread fraying in the wind. Give me a week. I'll get my people too, Ethan. This time it was a woman in a navy pantsuit, her tone final and cutting. It's not your team. It's the law. And the public. Nobody wants their name in a headline next to coastal destruction. Not these days. Someone stifled a sigh. A phone buzzed. A pen rolled off the table, clattering to the floor. No one picked it up. In 10 minutes. Ethan Cross's multi-million-dollar dream. The resort that would have stamped his name onto the richest strip of coastline in the country was collapsing in real time. The man who never lost was suddenly watching the exit doors swing open, his future stepping out of the room in polished leather shoes. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself, fighting to keep his expression composed. His jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. For the first time in years, since he'd clawed his way from cheap suits and rented offices to private jets and penthouses. Ethan Cross felt it, a chill of helplessness curling around his throat like a rope, and somewhere behind him, unnoticed, the maid dusting the windows paused. She watched him with quiet eyes, the only witness to the great Ethan Cross, the unstoppable dealmaker. Realizing he wasn't so unstoppable after all. Not today, as the men argued. Rosa stood frozen by the window, her hands trembling around the damp edge of her cleaning cloth. The voices bounced off the glass and marble like sharp pebbles, all talk of risk and profit and lawsuits she'd only halfway understood, until now. She glanced at the blueprints sprawled across the gleaming conference table, glossy pages smudged by rich fingers tapping in frustration. She saw the bright red lines marking property boundaries, the carefully penciled villas perched so close to the dunes they might as well have been balanced on sea foam. She looked at Ethan Cross, his perfect hair a little out of place now, his forehead shiny with sweat he was trying to hide with that forced grin. She'd seen him dozens of times, striding through these halls, barking orders nobody dared question, and then she did something nobody expected that Rosa's heart slammed. So hard against her ribs, she thought she might faint. She opened her mouth once, but her voice caught in her throat. She tried again, this time louder, fighting past the invisible wall that always made her small. "Excuse me, sir. Mr. Cross." The argument died mid-sentence. The suits turned to her as if they'd heard a ghost speak. A few eyebrows shot up, some eyes narrowed in annoyance. An interruption from the help? Davenport, who'd just finished snapping his briefcase shut, let out a scoffing breath, half laughing already. To Ethan's frown deepened, as if a fly had landed on his precious pitch deck. "Not now, Rosa," he snapped, the last word sharp enough to sting. But Rosa didn't step back. Her hands were shaking, but she locked her knees, made her voice come out steady. I think I know how to fix your problem." For a heartbeat, the room went utterly still, like someone had sucked all the air out through the glass windows. Davenport tilted his head, a cruel smile curling at his lips. "The maid has ideas for a multi-million-dollar development? This should be good." Someone near him chuckled under their breath. A woman with cold eyes smirked down at her notes, already dismissing Rosa. But Rosa felt the spark in her chest push her fear aside. She could see her father's face so clearly now, weathered skin, kind eyes, his strong hands guiding hers. Over maps and markers in the hot coastal sun back home in Veracruz, she took a step forward. "My father was a coastal engineer in Mexico. He worked for resorts and government projects. When I was young, I helped him survey sites just like this. I learned where dunes shift, how erosion works. If you move your resort just 200 meters east, you'd avoid building on the protected dunes." She pointed to the bright red lines on the blueprints with her cloth, careful not to smudge them. Her voice strengthened with each word. "If you do that, the environmental groups lose their biggest weapon. And if you promise to restore native dune plants on the old spot, the city council will like it. It's a trade-off. They want to see a balance, some development, some restoration." Her accent slipped in and out when she got nervous, but the words came out clear enough. Rosa forced herself not to shrink under their stares. Nobody spoke. Davenport's smirk faded a fraction, his eyes flicking back to the plans like maybe, just maybe, he'd missed something. Another investor leaned closer to the blueprints, squinting at the property lines. Ethan looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. The maid who'd blended into the edges of his empire, her brown hands scrubbing at invisible dust while he spun dreams he barely understood himself. "How do you know that?" Ethan asked, voice low, almost wary that Rosa's heart thumped. Her pulse roared in her ears, but she stood straighter. "Because I read your plans every week when I clean this room. I know every page by heart. I've seen your maps, the council memos on that table, the news articles you leave open on your laptop." She swallowed. "I didn't mean to pry, but I listen, and I remember." Someone let out a soft whistle, half amazed, half mocking. The silence stretched again, but now it felt different, like a crack in a dam that might burst open any second. Davenport's fingers drummed on his briefcase. "You're saying a maid," he paused, as if tasting the word, "has done more due diligence than Cross's entire legal team?" No one laughed this time. That Ethan's eyes flicked from Rosa to the blueprints and back again. For the first time that morning, the arrogance slipped from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. Or maybe desperation. To Rose's chest rose and fell as she forced herself to keep looking him in the eye. She had spoken. She had broken the silence. Now it was up to him to listen. To Ethan's mind raced so fast he barely heard the shuffle of expensive shoes or the soft hum of the projector in the corner. He grabbed the edge of the blueprint and spun it around, the glossy paper sliding dangerously close to Rose's cleaning cloth. "Show me," he said, his voice stripped of its usual polish. Raw and demanding, but not dismissive this time. "Show me exactly where." Rosa didn't flinch. She stepped closer, careful not to touch the suits crowded around the table's edge. With steady fingers, she pointed to the red property line, then traced an invisible path just east of it. "Here," she said, tapping the map. "This slope is stable, better soil for foundation piles, the council's own soil reports say. So, you wouldn't need as much reinforcement, so construction is cheaper too." A murmur of surprise moved through the room like a warm breeze. Ethan's eyes narrowed, but not with suspicion, with focus. He fired off questions, one after another, sharper than the polished steel pen he twirled between his fingers. "What about road access?" "It's there already. The old service road from the seafood cannery. It connects straight to the highway. Less traffic for the neighborhood, less pushback. Drainage? Better here than near the dunes. You just need a retention pond. You can make that a decorative water feature, too. And the environmental groups? They'll fight, but if you restore the old site with native plants, they'll have to call it a net positive. They'd look bad fighting a developer helping local wetlands recover." Each answer came clear and calm. Her Spanish accent thickened. When she said certain words, restauración, acceso, but no one interrupted her to mock her pronunciation now. They were listening because suddenly this was real again. Davenport leaned over the map, his reading glasses perched halfway down. His nose. He squinted at the boundary lines, then at Rosa, then at Ethan. Slowly, he sat back, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his thin lips. "If you do this, if you shift the build here, pledge the dune restoration, tap into community funding, you'll have my money, cross. The permits won't stand in your way. You might even get the city to back you publicly." A ripple of agreement moved around the table. The younger investors who had packed up their pens were now leaning back in, nodding, recalculating margins in their heads. The mood had flipped, just like that. Not by Ethan's silver tongue, but by a quiet voice no one had ever thought to hear. Ethan exhaled so slowly, he almost laughed. He felt his shoulders drop for the first time all morning. His mind played out the numbers, the press releases, the triumphant headlines. Cross Resorts breaks ground on sustainable coastal haven. He saw the champagne toasts again. Only this time, the taste of them was real, but even as relief surged through him, something else gnawed at the edges of his pride. He looked at Rosa, really looked at her. The simple uniform, the battered cloth still gripped in her hand like a shield, the steady eyes that held his gaze without flinching. She wasn't trembling now. She wasn't small. She was, impossibly, the smartest person in the room. Ethan stepped closer, ignoring the curious eyes around them. He reached out his hand, the same hand he'd shaken with mayors, billionaires, celebrity partners. "Rosa Alvarez," he said, voice softer now. "You just saved my entire company." Rosa blinked, her lashes fluttering as if she might wake up from a dream. She glanced at his hand, then at the ring of investors staring at her with something like newfound respect, or at least wary fascination. Ethan cleared his throat. "How? Would you like to come work with me, Rosa?" He paused, the next words leaving his mouth slower, heavier, but more genuine than any pitch he'd made that morning. "Not for me. With me." A hush settled over the room. Davenport's brows lifted. The young investor closest to Ethan gave an impressed whistle. For the first time in her life, Rosa felt dozens of powerful eyes turn to her not as a shadow on the wall, but as the future. She swallowed. Her fingers curled around her cleaning cloth, the last trace of the life she'd lived in silence at the edges of other people's power. Slowly, Rosa lifted her chin, her father's voice in her head telling her to stand tall, always. She took Ethan's hand, small, warm, calloused from hard work he'd never know. She didn't smile yet. She didn't need to. "I'd like that," Rosa said. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the crystal-lit conference room like a promise. Ethan's grin returned, but this time it was real. For once, the kingmaker hadn't saved the day. The maid had. That afternoon, the deal that had been moments from ruin was signed, the pages thick with fresh signatures and the ink of second chances. The investors filed out of the crystal-lit boardroom with murmured congratulations and half-curious glances at the quiet woman walking beside Ethan Cross, no longer invisible in her crisp uniform, but standing just as tall as any suit in that room. Outside the heavy doors, the hallway bustled, with polished shoes and hushed phone calls. Ethan fell into step beside Rosa, his stride matching hers instead of charging ahead like usual. He didn't hold the door for her like a boss for an assistant. He held it open like an equal for an equal. For the first time, she didn't fade into the marble floors or disappear behind the shine of someone else's power. She was the power. They stepped into the quiet corridor overlooking the city skyline, Manhattan's glass towers rising like monuments to ambition. Ethan slipped his hands into his pockets, watching the late sun glint off the windows across the street. His face, so often a mask of smug certainty, looked softer now. Humbled, if only a little. He turned to Rosa, curiosity plain in his eyes. "You know," he said, shaking his head with a small laugh. "I have to ask, why didn't you ever tell anyone? Any of this? You could have left cleaning behind a long time ago." Rosa met his eyes without flinching, her cloth still tucked in her pocket, like a memory of the life she'd outgrown in a single afternoon. She smiled, small but strong. "Because people see what they want to see, Mr. Cross. They see a maid, someone quiet, invisible, simple. They don't see an engineer's daughter who spent nights listening to her father explain sea currents and soil erosion instead of bedtime stories. They don't see how much I remember." She shrugged lightly, glancing down at the city far below. Tiny cars crawling like ants on shining streets. "I always knew someday someone would need what I know. So I waited. I listened. I watched." Her eyes flicked back to him, a spark there now that he'd missed 1,000 times before. "You just happened to be the first one desperate enough to hear me." Ethan's laugh this time was genuine, and he shook his head like he couldn't believe the lesson he'd been handed. Maybe he couldn't. For years, he'd surrounded himself with men in tailored suits and women with expensive degrees, people who bragged about what they knew at the top of their lungs. And here was Rosa, the maid no one saw, whose quiet knowledge saved him when all the polished experts failed. He offered her his hand again. The second handshake, this one without an audience. "Well, Rosa Alvarez, you're not scrubbing windowsills anymore. Starting today, you're my new coastal development consultant. Full-time. Name your salary." Rosa hesitated, then took his hand, her grip firm. She didn't tell him her salary. Dreams were small compared to this. That what really mattered was the respect, the seat at the table, the chance to build instead of just wipe away the dust. And so she did. In the months that followed, Rosa's father's notebooks came out of their dusty box under her bed. She spread them across Ethan's glass conference tables, pointing to old sketches of seawalls and mangrove gardens. She taught Ethan's well-paid architects how to read a coastline like a living map. She corrected engineers twice her size when they got sloppy. And she signed her name next to his on the next set of blueprints. The maid's name now printed in bold under consulting lead.as for Ethan Cross, the man who'd always trusted money more than people. He learned something priceless that day. Something no deal sheet or quarterly report had ever taught him. He learned that sometimes the smartest investment doesn't come embossed in gold on a contract or spelled out by lawyers charging $1,000 an hour. Sometimes the smartest investment is listening to the quiet voice in the back of the room, the one you nearly stepped over on your way to the top. Months later, when reporters wrote about the groundbreaking resort project that turned a threatened coastline into a shining example of sustainable luxury, they put Ethan's name in the headlines. But they also mentioned a woman named Rosa Alvarez, the coastal expert who made it possible. And in every polished lobby where she walked now, people looked twice. They asked questions. They listened. And that's the true power of hidden talent. You never know who's standing just behind you, holding the knowledge that could change your life forever. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us. Never underestimate the quiet people you overlook. One day, Their voice might just be the one that saves everything you've built.